Guys, this is Kenjiro and welcome to another PaintShop Pro video. Today I want to share with you a little project that I've just been working on which aims to try to produce something like high resolution AI style. Now when I mention AI styles, what I'm referring to is the instant effects, the AI powered instant effects. I'm using version 2021 right now. There's an enhanced version of this tool in 2022, but I don't have that version. Earlier versions, when this capability first came out, it was referred to as pick to painting, and it was a plugin. So the way that you run it is slightly different. Now, this tool has come a long way. This capability has come a long way. A lot of features have been added, and it can create some really cool effects. One thing, however, that I've at least noticed just in my own usage of it is that whenever I've wanted to use it, it really produces something that, in my opinion, feels a little too low resolution. So, like when I see this image, for example, I took a foresty scene, had a lot of detail to begin with, applied the stained glass effect, and for sure, it absolutely looks like stained glass, but so much of the fidelity of the image got lost that I would take a bit of imagination to recognize that this was really a foresty scene, and even one that just looked like what the original image is. Now, granted, some of the other AI styles work a little bit better in some cases, and also AI styles are probably applied in a manner that's designed to reduce fidelity because you're trying to make it look more like art, not this super fine detail of a photograph. But for me, I think I like the idea of something to look like art, but still have a little bit more fidelity than what, in my opinion, feels almost like becomes a blob. Or in some of the other AI style implementations, you can almost sense like the pixelation in the image, regardless of what your starting resolution is. So I wanted to do a little bit of experimentation in trying to achieve something like AI styles, but in higher resolution. And so we'll get into the technique that I used and how we got there. But I just wanted to show really quick some examples of what a high resolution AI style would look like compared to what it originally does. So you can see on the left here, this is an example of my approach to trying to produce a high resolution AI style application. One thing you may notice is that there's sort of this like noticeable grid pattern that's happening here. There's some discontinuities in both luminance and color, and I'll explain why that's happening. But that's compared to the originally produced. I think this is design. This is depth by design. And so in here, on the right side, the original implementation, you would be able to tell that this is like an elephant in sort of like a sunrisey lit, environment. On the left, though, you really can kind of, feel more of the texture, see the details and like the eyes and just some of the wrinkles in the body. It's still a little bit nebulous where the elephant is, but it still very much looks like a painting, but with a lot more fidelity. One more comparison example. This is using slumber on an image of a dog. And you can kind of see, the original slumber looks great. Honestly, I think it came out, pretty well. The colors look good and everything like that. And then using high resolution slumber on the sort of right of this diagonal, and then preserving original colors, and both of them look pretty good. I think as you zoom in, though, say on the face, then you can start to really see the difference that, on the left, it really does feel very pixelated, even though we're not really getting to the level of a singular pixel at, this level of zoom. And on the right side, it still has that very painterly feel, but you can see there's a lot more fidelity. You see a lot more direction and texture in the fur and all that kind of stuff like that. And so, ignoring the discontinuities, like I said, of the lines, it would for me, I really like this level of fidelity. So let's now dive into how we can achieve something like this. So to demonstrate this technique, I am going to be using this forest image. And essentially what the technique is applying AI styles, just like we saw before, but in smaller portions, in small regions of the image, and then remapping them back onto the original image. So as you can imagine conceptually, since AI style seems to naturally apply a low res sort of, result, if we have that only act as a small portion of the image, then in aggregate, when we put them all together, we're going to get a higher resolution image. Now, this mapping, segregating, aligning, all that stuff, would be a great pain to try to do manually. So I created a script that's going to help automate this and do all of that alignment for me. And I'm going to make it available to everybody. So you don't have to be a patron or do buy it from Teespring. You can think of this as like a parting gift in a way, even though this is sort of like a very unique and funny sort of technique. But it's pretty fun to play with. So I'm just going to show how to use this script, and then we'll take a look at some of the results and some things we can do to play with it after the fact, and then also how to, at least in the near term, mitigate some of the discontinuities that you see produced in the image from using this technique. But to start off, so I have my high res AI style script selected. And if I just hit run, then what we'll see is this nice little dialog box comes up. And from here we can select whichever style we want to apply. I am going to use stained glass in this case. I am going to use the maximum strength, although that can be adjusted. And then really, it's just a matter of choosing what level of resolution. And this number really can just be thought of as how many rows and columns do we really want to break this image up into. The more rows and columns you have, the longer it'll take. But the more detail you're going to get in the final image. I think if you go too high, then you're pretty much going to look like a photograph anyway. So, the slider probably is much bigger than it needs to be, but I'm going to go 5. I've done some tests. I think 5 looks really good. And then after making all those settings, then we just hit OK. Now I'm going to put a little timer here just to kind of show, how long this is going to take while I explain a little bit about what's going on. But as you can see, it really just grabs a segment of the image, 1/5 in this case, and then it runs the AI style and then pastes it once again into the image in the location where it belongs. Now, one thing I'll say for this script to work, it actually requires that you have a version of PaintShop Pro that supports the scriptable execution of pick to painting. And as far as I understand, I believe that is only possible once the AI effects was integrated into the Adjust tab. If you have a version of PaintShop Pro where pick to painting was a plugin, this script probably will not work. So I'm going to speed this up at this point just because it does take a while to kind of walk through each 1/25th of the image, but I put the timer up there just to be able to help you get an idea of how long this actually takes. All right, so we've made it to the end of the full processing of this image, applying the pick to painting to all the 25, regions of the image. And as you can see, it took about 5 minutes and 35 seconds. So, in thinking about, a plugin or whatever, or an effect, being provided by, a company like Corel to do something, having an execution time of 5 minutes and 35 seconds probably seems a little bit overwhelming for folks. But my position on this particular approach is that if I can get the image to look the way that I want it to, nobody has to twist my arm for me to be able to kick back and drink more coffee and then wait for this thing to finish. But that's obviously having that level of expectation to begin with before starting. All right, so What we've ended up with now when the script has fully run, as you can tell, this is the same stained glass AI effect, except it is of much higher fidelity. You can see all the leaves and even the mini leaves on the ferns and all those kinds of things. And although yes, very much still abstract, you can see textures on trees and all that kind of stuff like that. And since I have version 2021, I don't have the slider that allows me to preserve original color. So the way that I get around that is by just having the original background, and then with the AI modified layer, changing the blend mode to Luminance Legacy. So then what we end up with here, what you see is some of that original color is now brought back. Green's kind of on the bottom, and this sort of sun shining color through the trees at the top. Now, once again, you can still see some, discontinuities in the image where the tiling occurs, and my conjecture is that this occurs primarily because when the AI algorithms run, they sample the entire image, but in this case, that's just a small segment, and they get full dynamic range and color kind of stuff, and when it does its tone and hue mapping, it bases it on the surrounding data. So when you restrict the region that it is familiar with or that it's analyzing, then you're going to get these discontinuities versus if it were actually surveying the whole image. So now that we've produced this, I'm just going to play with it a little bit more so we can get something that looks kind of neat. And then we'll talk about some techniques for dealing with the discontinuities. But first, I think I want to increase the contrast of this image that we have here, so we can go to our layer adjustments and go to levels. And this is just going to be a increasing contrast, so making the whites even whiter, but then definitely bringing in the darks so that we can get a lot more of those thick lines that really kind of represent like the stained glass, bordering that is pretty common. Increasing the contrast also has the effect of bringing out a little bit more of the color, I would say. Another thing we can do to really pump up the color even more is to bring another adjustment layer and change it to vibrancy. And then just drag that slider to the right until the color, represents a level of vibrancy that you like. And then next, I kind of want to darken this region near the bottom here. It feels more like, the light source, even if we were thinking stained glass is kind of coming through here. And so, the you would kind of expect in this sort of scene of a forest that these parts would be darker. So the way that we can do that is by creating a new raster layer, changing its blend mode to burn, and then just regular paintbrush over here, regular shape, maybe make it pretty large just so that it can kind of blend in, and a low hardness, and then we can just start painting around in this region down here. And if it feels like it's a little too intense, you can bring it, dial back the opacity. And in a way, this can be, you can think of this almost as like a manual vignette, just darkening around the edges, just to bring more of that focus of the brightness to the middle. All right, that's looking pretty good. I think I'm gonna bump up the vibrancy just a little bit more. Really get that bright stained glass sort of feel. All right, so this is looking pretty good. I think the next thing that I want to do is, address the discontinuities, right? These grid-looking things. Now, since this is meant to be a stained glass type of image, you can think of it in terms of like it being almost like a window. And so another script that I've written is a vector-based one, which simply just draws a black grid. And so if I align the grid with where the boundaries of all the different segments are, it's going to at least visually minimize, the obviousness of some of the discontinuities of where the processing was done. So, for example, in this case, since I chose 5, as long as I have my grid match 5, and I can do a pretty small border width, so I'll do something like 10, hit OK. It's going to create a new layer. It's going to draw an outer border as well as all these little lines across. So then in here now, we've got something that looks like a window's framed, and it's got, all these little panels that have stained glassy parts in it. And, just for fun, we could add a sunburst here almost to kind of make it feel like the sun is actually coming through. But since the sunburst doesn't work on transparent layers, what I'm going to do is say copy merged and then paste as a new layer. So now really what I have is a copy of like everything underneath all smashed into one layer. And then what I can do is go to effects, illumination effects, and sunburst. And so since I, have done this before, I've run through this before, you can see that my sunburst happened to be in the perfect spot of where the, sun is actually shining on that original forest image. But, if you needed to adjust where the sunburst was, it's just a matter of, playing with these different numbers until that bright spot lands where you want it to be. And there you have it. So you can, kind of consider how this image looks with all of its like fine detail, still very stained glassy in nature, by comparison to the very low res version if you just used the AI style out of the box. So I just wanted to show one other technique for dealing with the discontinuities if you're using this script. If we take this image here and I have already run the script on this image, but using the Tokyo style. And, generally speaking, I feel like it worked pretty well. There isn't like too much discontinuity problems that are really obvious for this particular kind of style, except for the sky, right? You can see very much that when there isn't a lot of data or essentially when you have like something that's very monochrome monoluminance, not a lot of variation, it's going to treat it very differently than something in a region that has the really dark areas and really light areas. So that's why you get something that looks very different than the rest of the pieces around it. But in this method, if we draw up a grid, it can kind of help. You may or may not really want a grid on your image in the end. But these kinds of lines can easily be mitigated by just simply using the clone tool. So if we, just were to go to this tool here, select clone. In this particular case, square shaped is probably perfectly fine, and a pretty high hardness because you don't, this type of style, you don't really have like blended regions or soft regions, but you can really just sample, some place that's right next to it. And as long as you're, going over where the lines are, or you're focusing on trying to, make the lines seem less obvious, then you can kind of erase them, if you will. So simply being just a little bit strategic about where you sample and just making sure to hit the edges. One thing I always recommend when it comes to using the clone tool is change your reference often, and then you can prevent what always seems like the notorious cloning repeating pattern, maybe around the edges here. Don't need it to be so strong. But there you go, just as an example, with this image now, since the sky was the, great offender of making it really obvious that this was kind of done in tiles, that just by using the clone tool in this very homogeneous region of the sky, you can dramatically reduce that sort of discontinuity appearance. So anyway, that's it for this one. Again, just wanted to share with you what I was working on. I really wanted to be able to, use some AI style effects, but just the detail wasn't there. So I started playing around with this. And you can find the information on how to get both this script and the grid script in the description of the video. I shared with you some techniques for mitigating sort of the discontinuities, the whole tiling effect. But hopefully, I think really what would be nice is if Corel actually implemented a slider that allowed you to adjust the scale, and maybe it just provides you some expectation of how long it'll take, to process the whole image if you choose to do a high resolution implementation. But I really like how the high resolution looks apart from the discontinuities. I think having that greater level of detail and that increased sharpness, but still having these, very abstract painterly effects or whatever the effect happens to be. It's a really nice combination if you can get both. But for now, if you find that you appreciate it as much as I do, feel free to use this script, experiment, and I hope you can enjoy it and have a little bit of fun. As always, if you have any questions or would like to suggest content, feel free to leave a comment. If you'd like to get updates of new videos that I post, click the subscribe button, and you can check the video description for ways to support and engage the channel, and I'll see you guys next time.